So, hello everyone, and welcome to another live stream from Just in Time Worldbuilding. With me is an amazing guest today, Adrian Tchaikovsky, author of Shadows of the App, Children of Time, and Children of Ruin, and a plethora of other books. So, Adrian, do you want to just briefly kind of introduce us to who you are and so on?
Yeah, sure. I am a British science fiction and fantasy writer. I was published first in 2007 with the Shadows of the App series, which is arguably 17 books, which is far too many books for a series. I am best known for writing books about giant spiders from outer space, which is Children of Time and its sequels, but I've written in a variety of corners of the genre, novels and novellas and a bit of short stories as well.
So today we're going to talk, it's our second conversation actually, because our last one was about creating species and so on. And during that time, we got into a conversation about political fantasy and how you write it and all of the kind of tricks and trades, which was a sideshow for that conversation, but is the main event for this one. So we are going to be talking about political fantasy and where it comes from, how we got where we are, and all of the kind of pitfalls and how to make it interesting and all the rest of that. So just before we get into that, just to pay the bills, guys, we are in the final 48 hours of the Worldbuilding Blueprints Volume 1 Kickstarter. And we've already hit the stretch, two of the stretch goals. So go ahead and back the Kickstarter, link in the description and all that. You are referenced in that book. Now, it is a non-fiction book I wrote about world building.
That's very kind. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I was doing kinship models, and I was talking about like what to do if you have a non-human species. And so I drew on the example of your spiders and how they are linked through names and understandings and the nanovirus and all the rest of that kind of aspects, rather than, say, blood relationship, consanguinity, kinship, and so on. So I thought it was a very out there example of a kinship model. So, let's talk about the origins of fantasy story and politics. Now, when we first spoke about this, you mentioned the kind of romance novels, right? Or the medieval romance novels and their hidden princes. But before we talk about that, I just want to briefly go back even to the Bronze Age and like the mythic origins, right? Because our oldest myth is Gilgamesh, which is about a dude becoming a god king.
Yes. Yes, I mean it's a story where the protagonist is basically a mortal king who, at least, tries to become. I mean, it's interesting because it's also a story about hubris, which is fascinating. That the earlier story is essentially one that is telling powerful people not to overreach, which feels like a message for the ages, shall we say? So yes, but it is a story about a king, and the early stories tend to be about kings. I mean, obviously, we've got a plethora of Odyssey-related things there, and obviously, if you look at the Iliad, the Trojan War, the people we are most looking at, they are all kings and leaders. It's at no point did Homer or whoever the people who became collectively known as Homer decide to write a story about the common sort of hoplite or what have or proto hoplite or what have you in that sort of story. It is always about the kings, and then that becomes the princes later on in those romances. But initially it is at a time when presumably kings are a bit more active because they're kind of just sort of warlords who have to go and lead the army themselves, or the army isn't going to do anything. Those stories, the people who get to fight the monsters and are beloved of the gods and go on the quest and so forth, they're kings, or they're at least people of royal blood who will become the king when they have done the thing.
Right. And I mean, as you say, like nobody was writing stories about, Sarah the baker who's making a really fine bread or whatever, despite the fact that that was probably more
I mean,
important to their
I
day-to-day
guess
life.
I think you probably have, at the very minimum, two traditions arising from very early on.
Mm.
So you have, I think, the courtly epic saga type stories, which are told, which are they are the high art. They are the ones that you're doing the big poetry contests of. Those are the ones that will become the classics for the next sort of civilization along. Yes. Well, I've just had chat turn up Saint Sir Nicholas,
Yes,
so I'm guessing that is we by default we are. And at the same time, I suspect there are also going to be less not recorded, not put in writing, where you have a writing system to put it in, not part of these great sort of poetic cycles, but you're probably going to have the Jack type stories, the trickster stories. I mean, if you look at the Arabian Nights, which inherit a lot of earlier story cycles, there are plenty of stories about caliphs and princes and so forth, but there are also plenty of stories about beggars and wily merchants and that sort of thing. So I think it is mostly that the stories that get written down and sort of intentionally perpetuated by the movers and shakers of society are those that flatter that social class. But I suspect there must always have been the story about the poor but clever person getting by on their wits.
Yeah, the trickster and the hero seem to be one of the core things that have survived to us from many myths.
Yes, and I mean the interesting thing about Odysseus is he is both, which is probably why his stories are more often retold in this later age than the ones that are just about great big beefy people hitting things. And I mean, Odysseus's ancestry is interesting because he's a king, but if you go back 2 generations, his grandfather is just a thief. So he's kind of the fusion of those traditions.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm pulling this out of the air. I am not in any way a folklore scholar, and I should probably just set out my lack of credentials from the start.
Me either, Mike. I studied mathematics, but I'm with you there. But I am a ardent amateur scholar of early folklore and mythology and so on. Okay, so let's talk about those medieval romances and their impact on fantasy, because that's kind of where it eventually, the myths are interesting, but the medieval romances are where it kicked off.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of fascinating because we hit a time when actually being big and beefy and hitting things is not the sole measure of the heroic ideal. I mean, all of these characters, all of these kind of questing heroes, Orlando and so forth, they are all big and beefy and they all hit people extremely well, but there is also expected to be, there is a level of virtuous conduct, and then you get the whole courtly love thing, which is sort of a fascinating element in and of itself. And it's a point where the concept of what a hero does becomes interestingly complicated, but they're all still princes. It is very much this is the only people who are allowed to find the Grail or defeat the monster, or rescue the princess and marry her in these stories. They are all already a member of an extremely rarefied elite social class, and obviously it's reflecting in sort of medieval Europe, when these stories are going about, that is, there is an elite social class who have a monopoly on sort of the control of force and that sort of thing. So it's reflecting that if you had like I say, the peasant stories will exist at this point as well, but they are again going to be they are not going to be recorded and sanctified and promulgated in the same sort of semi-official way.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting because like Chaucer, which is, I guess, one of our big surviving tales from the period, did have an element of telling common people stories as well.
Chaucer's very special. I mean, I think he's one of the first people to do that. And obviously, Chaucer makes his name because he is a royal favourite. He is absolutely recognised in his lifetime as being something remarkably special in the field of storytelling. And he does a very lot of other things. He has official positions. He does a lot of diplomatic stuff, I think, does a lot of travelling. But that's the thing that he is specifically valued for. I think there's one point where he's the person that gets ransomed by the king because he is this absolute sort of favorite entertainer and tale teller. And yes, he is genuinely interested in a very, very fine detail level about the lives of very ordinary people. He's not even though you've got I think in the Knight's Tale, it plugs in, not the film, obviously, the Chaucerian story. It plugs into that.
Yeah, the
romantic
movie is
tradition.
related to his story.
The movie is an absolute masterpiece, and it does draw a certain amount from Chaucer. Yeah. Obviously, we have Paul Bettany being Chaucer in the movie, delightfully.
Yes.
But the Knight's Tale, as Chaucer writes it, again, and this is my interpretation of it, Chaucer is taking what is by that time quite a tired, old-fashioned story trope and making fun of it. So Chaucer is most definitely a new generation of writer, and the romance type tradition that we're talking about is kind of on its way out. Or is at least it's at the point where it's a bit like the way that if you look at Golden Age comic stories, modern comic stories like modern Marvel stories will often end up kind of poking fun or doing interesting new takes on a gold. You'll take a character who only really turned up in Captain America issue 4. And then they'll turn up again in the 1990s with a completely new backstory and a completely new reinterpretation. And it's kind of that thing that Chaucer is doing. And then later on you have Shakespeare does some sort of cod chivalry stuff, but it's never done. No one's doing it straight at that point because it's very, very old fashioned. If you're doing it, you're doing a modern, in that, in the context of the writer, a modern take on that, and frequently you're sending it up in the same way that the Romans loved their funny Hercules plays. Now, Hercules, obviously, in the original myth, he murders his whole family in a fit of rage and then has to do a dreadful penance with the tasks of Hercules, something which is amazingly not included in the Disney film. But when you get to the Romans, Hercules is just this incredible bore and bumbler who turns up in plays and just everyone finds him utterly socially intolerable. And he's a figure of fun. And so, it's the fascinating thing of, we didn't, the modern art doesn't invent the parody. The parody exists at a time when we think of people as writing like the original ancient classic, they're already doing parodies of previous modes of storytelling. Even like the satire plays in ancient Greece, they're people sending up their own. Yeah, but Henry V is not doing a romance quest narrative.
No.
Saint Sir. He is, and there's a whole different discussion on where Henry V comes from, obviously, which is mostly fear of actual war with foreign powers, and therefore you're bigging up the British military history. And amazingly, Shakespeare doesn't mention the next battle Henry V gets into, where he gets by the French.
But it's also, Henry V, all of the historical plays, the English historical plays were written a little bit to gild the lily, right? Because Shakespeare's primary patron was Elizabeth. And that's why Richard III is this horror of a man in Shakespeare's stories.
Yes,
it's very propaganda.
And it's worth noting, of course, the best scene for my money in Henry V is the scene where he goes in disguise and meets the common soldiers, which Shakespeare gives so much weight to and then utterly squanders after the battle when he said, "Oh, how many of our people died?" And says, "Oh, this noble, this noble, this noble, and some other guys." And you just kind of feel that all of that goodwill about the common person is just being completely kicked to touch, because in that kind of narrative, it's not important.
Yeah.
Regular people die, but that is, as long as the king gets what the king wants, then that's fine.
Although I will say the speech of St. Crispin's Day, that
we
have no evidence that Henry V said, to be fair, Shakespeare put those words in his mouth, but that was brilliant. That is one of the best speeches ever.
I mean, I am not at any point going to suggest that Shakespeare could not write.
Yeah.
I mean, if nothing else, I absolutely do a lot of Shakespeare stuff in my own writing. So yes, he could certainly write, but that wasn't really the sort of Shakespeare stuff I was thinking of when I was talking about Shakespeare doing the cod romance.
Yeah, because I mean, he does flip his romances. If I think of his romances, they're not, when they do the medieval ones, they almost poke fun at them a little bit. If we think about like Much Ado About Nothing and so on.
Yes, and they're the whole scene in As You Like It where there's like someone has to overcome. There's a serpent and there's a lion and all that sort of thing. And it doesn't happen on stage. It's just being retold. And a lot of the problem plays, like The Winter's Tale, have weird bits like that which feel like they come from that kind of story, but they are genuinely played light and played for laughs. Yes. No one is doing the genuine po-faced medieval romance because that's 300-400 years old at that point. That's very, very, it's not even your grandfather's type of fiction at that point.
Yeah.
But that type of fiction doesn't really go away. And then of course you get Tolkien.
Yes.
I'm sure Tolkien isn't the first one to be doing this, but Tolkien is one of those who is looking at that kind of tradition when he's doing his sort of constructed myth cycle. Which is, of course, one reason why when you have the Fellowship of the Ring, except for the hobbits, 3 of whom I will point out are gentry, and you have 1 token peasant. But all of the other guys, apart from the Gandalf, the demigod wizard, are princes, or in one case, a king in exile. Legolas is not just an elf; he's an elven prince. Gimli is a dwarven prince. Boromir is the heir to the stewardship of Gondor. These are not like normal guys, but it is absolutely that medieval romance idea of you get a bunch of people together and every single one of them is a prince of somewhere, as if this is the thing that princes can just do, is swan off with a bunch of other princes and do quests. And that's the model that the romances are using, and that is the model that Tolkien picks up. And then you get later on the Belgariad, and I think most of Belgarian's companions are also princes,
or lords, all of them.
And again, and it's just become the model at that point that you just like normal people are not allowed to have adventures, except maybe the one person, the Frodo analog, gets to be about as normal as Frodo, which is to say extremely affluent landed gentry, and everyone else is a warrior prince of the blood, and the idea that a fantasy country in a secondary fantasy world is not a hereditary monarchy is usually only reserved for evil countries where the king needs to be restored. I mean, it's endlessly frustrating to me because I am not a monarchist. That this model just seems to be so hard to shake, or at least so hard to present on the page without at least examining it.
I think one of my biggest bugbears about political fantasy, any political fantasy, is this like there's 2 things that drive me up the wall, and the one is if we just replace the bad king with a good king, all will be well in the land. And I'm like,
yes, and that tends to be how it goes. It's just like it's not the institution of monarchy that is the problem. It is having the wrong person on the throne, which of course means that there is de facto divine right and all a right person to be on the throne, and you get this sort of the only reason that the land is ill because the king is ill, or the land is ill because it's the wrong king, and all you need all you need is an absolute ruler who is in some way more beneficial or more benevolent rather than the evil usurping vizier. The Shire and Lake Town are republics. I can't remember. I've got to say, my mind fails as to how the Shire even governed at all by anyone.
The Shire technically is a king. The Shire is complicated because technically they're a king, sort of.
I mean, I know the Shire has a very clear, very British class structure. So if it's the Republic, it's the sort of republic where the vast majority of people presumably don't get a vote. Doesn't Lake Town has a master? I have no idea how the master of Lake Town is appointed.
I can't remember. Like,
or even because I mean, presumably, given how exhaustively Tolkien wrote, I'm sure it's in there somewhere, but I don't think it's specifically mentioned in the Hobbit per se. So it's just that there is a master, and if I recall in the film, it's Stephen Fry.
Yeah. He's not the best of guys, but those movies weren't fantastic. So we have,
and again, I suppose that's the other problem. It's just Lake Town goes bad very quickly when there's gold around. I don't think Lake Town is actually, Bard, and isn't the whole thing with Bard is of the bloodline of ancient kings or something like that, because he's the good guy and the master is in the book
because he shoots the arrow that kills Smaug. But I'd have to look it up. So Ryan, who has posted that kings can be good and we don't just need liberal democracy in our fantasy. Sure, my problem isn't actually that it's always a king or whatever. So I would prefer to have other systems than king. My problem is that there is never, or very rarely, is there a fantasy political story that addresses the fact that there are more than just the guy in charge that drives politics. It is more than just the human who leads the kingdom that determines the kingdom's direction. And if something really disastrous happens, you need to change more than just put a better guy in charge. Just to clarify kind of my issue. Like, I'm not a fan of the system of monarchy because I don't believe that people are born better. And I don't think that is a good way to choose a ruler. But at the same time, like I think a very good example is actually if we look at history in terms of the Roman Republic falling apart. At the point where Caesar declared himself dictator for life, the Roman Republic was rife with issues. And it was technically a sort of democracy. Like they had a very tricky democracy, but it was a democracy. The problem is that
for a given value of demos, let's say.
Yes. But the problem is that at the point where Caesar takes it over, they've completely lost touch with the peasant population, and it's all just the elites getting their own way. And a net end result of that is that the people are behind Caesar when he declares himself dictator for life. But Caesar didn't come out of nowhere. If Caesar had been shouting about becoming an emperor without the systemic problems that the Republic had run into, he would never have become dictator for life because the people would have rejected him. And that's kind of my point.
I'm sure. Yes, I mean it is of course quite alien to our modern eye that a troubled system might have someone turning up claiming that he will be someone of enormous wealth, influence, and high family turning up claiming that he will champion the people against the elites and drain the swamp, and etc. And then that's how you get emperors.
Yeah, and I mean, unfortunately, like I say, it's not like democracy is not immune to issues. Democracy has plenty of issues and can suffer from the same systemic values and need the same kind of reform. But
I guess the difference is that while I mean there is the saying about democracy is it's simultaneously a terrible system and the best one we've got. The thing about democracy is that theoretically at least has a better mechanism to address issues, but of course, as in every kind of society, the moment you get a group of people within that democracy who have a disproportionate leverage on it, they will immediately start working to lessen the effectiveness of any rectifying mechanism up until the point where you get that sort of wildly predatory oligarchy that the Roman Republic had, and that we kind of looking at right now.
Yeah, and the unfortunate result is that people then absolutely lose faith in democracy because they feel they have no impact on it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how much impact they feel they would have on a sort of an authoritarian state, but
yeah. One of the interesting, I just want to highlight this comment briefly because the Powder Mage series is in fact fantastic. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It is based on the French Revolution, and it is a blast. Pun intended. And the magic system is great as well. So, okay. So we've spoken a little bit about the big man of history theory, which is basically that, history is driven by people's actions, which is not... Okay, so obviously Julius Caesar had a big impact on history, and I'm not denying that in any way. I'm not saying he didn't. He had a massive impact. But Julius Caesar, without the right environment, wouldn't have been, wouldn't have created the first emperorship. The Chinese emperor who declared that there shall be no more voyages out of China and that everybody, China will become inward looking. His orders wouldn't have been followed had there not been an environment in China that became more inward looking. The society itself was at that stage in its life. These things are very much like societal dependent. And so I think, and we as fantasy authors, of course, we want to write about characters, right? So it is very easy to fall into that kind of like big man trap where there is like a person who somehow miraculously changes the world by themselves.
I mean, I think my best example for this would probably be the Abercrombie's First Law series. For someone who doesn't buy into that great man, because you have someone there who, across the series of the 3 books, he becomes the king of the big kingdom. He wins the big battle, and the one thing he's aware of at the end of it is he has absolutely been moved. If there is a great man of that history, it is the kind of the wizard behind the scenes who is just kind of shifting people around like game pieces. And on the far side, there is another wizard or group of wizards, and all of the regular politics and all of the battles and all of the kings and so forth, they have zero real agency in the world. And so he's left at the end of the day, yay, he's the king and he's won the thing and he's married the girl. And he's utterly miserable because he's seen enough behind the curtain to realize how little any of it means.
Yeah.
And, the big tides of history are going basically at the whim of a bank, I think, rather than anyone wearing a crown. And yeah, I mean, as far as the great man, I mean, you've got really, I think there are sort of, I guess there are 3 main positions to stand on. You either say, well, all right, the individual character of this individual great man is what gives you the events of history. Or you say, well, all right, well, if Hitler or Caesar or whoever had just fallen off a horse much, much earlier before they would have done their stuff, then someone else would be in that thing. And that point you have, well, that's essentially the tide of history that is going to cast someone up on the beach. And that person will be, in an almost Darwinian way, the person who is most fit to take advantage of the wider current of events that are going on. I mean, and you can absolutely, if you look at the Second World War, you can trace a series of events. Well, if this happened because of this, because of this, because of this, because of this, and without which we probably wouldn't have had a second sort of global conflict at that scale 20 years after the previous one. You can keep tracing it back all the way to the Russians being defeated by Japan, or
you can take it back to Bismarck and his councils of Europe.
But and the third one, of course, is just basically a lot of chaotic things happen. And then we rationalize them to say, well, they happen because this, and this. But much in the way of many things, there is so many butterflies flapping their wings at any time that it becomes basically impossible to call ahead of time what is going to happen and where it can go. And you can't do that foundation thing of saying, yes, this is this. I will now look ahead with my amazing predictive abilities and tell you where society will go for the next 10,000 years.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think I just want to highlight a big man of history, why I don't subscribe to that. So I'm South African, in case you didn't know. In 1985, we had a president called P.V. Botha, who was a piece of work, as most South African presidents at the time were. And everybody in 1985 was expecting P.V. Botha to announce that apartheid was going to be wound down. It was going to be the end of apartheid. We were going to start integrating our societies and move forward as a multiracial society. And then that guy stood up there in 85 with the generals around him, and he was like, "No, I'm declaring a military a martial law, and we will stick to the policy of our forefathers." And he basically he said, "Today we have crossed the Rubicon," with his finger doing that, tying back to Caesar. Anyway, so that guy then tried very hard to preserve the system, but they essentially, in the end, they couped him, and apartheid was unwound. It came together, South Africa came together as a multiracial country, etc., etc. And that's because the society were no longer behind PV. Neither white nor black South Africa at that point supported apartheid. Everybody wanted it to end, as proved by the 1990 referendum, which was overwhelmingly voted to end apartheid by white South Africa at the time. So society had moved on, and he hadn't. And no matter how much force he enacted, he couldn't hold that tide. But there is a point in fantasy where you can do all kinds of strange things because of magic, right? So why don't you talk about Shadows of the App briefly, and the time when the mages controlled the world?
Oh, well, I mean, I suppose it's something you never actually get to see per se. It's something that's merely spoken about. But some centuries before the time of the book was what they called the Days of Law, or if you are less enamored of it, the bad old days. It was a time when magic was dominant, and therefore those of the Kindon who could do magic basically ruled the roost. They were patently not very nice. Most of the non-magical Kindon were essentially slave peoples, ruled by these vastly powerful, there were moths who were big wizards, and there were the mantises who were kind of like sorceress warriors, and the spiders, and all of the other sort of grand old powers back in the day. And then essentially what mostly happened was someone invented a crossbow. The non-magical Kindon discovered essentially mechanisms, engineering. And because the magical Kindon couldn't understand it, they didn't see and weren't able to predict the problems that were coming when you suddenly have a large number of people who can do massed crossbow fire and make superior armor and siege weapons and so forth. And the whole magical shebang came down very quickly. And now it's kind of a footnote in the histories. And we've had several centuries of dominance by the other Kindon. And when you meet, the books are generally fairly sympathetic to the Moth Kindon and the Mantis Kindon and so forth, because they're basically holding on with their fingernails. And they're having a very bad time with it, and they live in very remote areas. And every so often they do get together and kind of have a crack at, they play their part in the big war against the Wasp Empire that the books are mostly about. But the main players in that war on both sides are the Apt Kindon, who basically kind of don't believe magic ever really existed now.
Right, except that ultimately we get, though, spoilers for those of you who haven't read Shadows of the Apt, so fair warning, but we do get an Empress of the Wasps who is a magician. And she has both temporal power, temporal political power, and blazing fantasy power.
Yes, it doesn't go terribly well for anyone particularly concerned. And I suppose at that point, yes, the fact that she has sort of a unique characteristic which determines the details of the war. I don't think it necessarily helps the Wasps particularly, because it means that an awful lot of her time and effort is spent doing things that no one else really understands for magical aims that don't particularly help the war or the Empire. And arguably, her being in that position with that particular set of abilities is probably a net loss for the Wasp Empire, rather than if they'd just gone for a full-on mechanized assault on Collegium. Because basically she rakes up a lot of old history in trying to, essentially, she has a magical rival who she is trying to overcome, and in doing so she opened a lot of things that shouldn't be opened, and then has to spend an awful lot of resources in the worst possible way trying to close them, which leads to an awful lot of different bits of the Wasp Empire working quite strongly against one another, because no one else really understands what it is that she's doing. So I don't think that's necessarily I don't think it quite. I mean, she is a remarkable character, but I think the magical situation she is involved in, which is sort of thrust upon her, it's not something that she schemed for or anything like that, is probably overall an impediment to her ambitions because of the distraction it proves.
So I would say that she was very much created by her circumstances. I mean, her brother kept her alive and shaped her into somebody who will survive at all costs, because she lived under the sword every day. And so I guess when the mosquitoes came with their offer, like, absolutely she would take it. Who wouldn't in that kind of situation? Like, that was my feeling of her anyway.
Yes, so yeah, I mean, she's set up to be the pawn of one of the old magical powers, which is making a bid for relevancy. She beats her brother, who wants to have her sacrifice. She beats the mosquito, who wants to do the sacrificing. Makes alliances with the right generals and ends up on top. But in doing so, she kind of inherits this magical power because of the ritual that gets sort of badly interrupted.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I enjoyed very much about Shadows of the Apt is that with Collegium especially, while Collegium, yes, they have the election and so on, that they elect their city-state that elects their leaders, there's also a, like, you don't shy away from the fact that there are also issues in Collegium. There are people who, are looking to sell Collegium down the river.
Oh yeah, I mean, you certainly have Quislings. I mean, you have there are a number of factions in Collegium. You have a semi-democracy because about a third of the house are also the academic staff of the college, which position automatically grants you a seat in the an unelected seat in the government, which is. Which I find is really weirdly hilarious, and means that a lot of the people there are not locals, because they tend to get a lot of sort of visiting academics from other places. Everyone else is voted for in the lots, and you get quite a lot of view on how they go about politics and the sort of platforms they run on, which are frequently incredibly abstruse. I mean, the plot of the fifth book, Scarab Path, is all basically the stuff going on in the background from a scene which is very like that bit at the beginning of Henry V with the two clergymen sort of talking about why they really want a war to run a distraction for their own benefit. The whole of the Scarab Path is set about by two people basically struggling over who is going to become the new speaker for the assembly. and it's also it's very obvious that there is a lot of corruption. There's a lot of sort of bribery of the polis. There are.
And I think that is a good answer, or a good place to start answering one of the comments that's caught my eye, which is, do you have any tips on how to write environmental politics without being preachy or copying Tolkien? So,
I mean, I think there's. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. So I was just going to say that I think that the way that you did democracy in Stenwald's case in the Collegium worked in that context, because you don't shy away from some of the uglier aspects, but you still show the strengths of the.
Are we talking environmental politics in the sense of actual sort of, climate change, environmental damage, that kind of thing? Because obviously that is something that Tolkien looks at with the Scouring of the Shire and so forth.
Yes, and I mean, he was very clearly, as he put it, on the side of the trees.
Yes. I mean, I think there's probably quite a lot of that out there. I mean, I think things like Gemsons' 5th season, for example, has an inherently environmental message. I mean, the way I would normally do it is, when I've done environmental stuff, I try and go down to how did it affect regular people, I suppose, because I think that when I've seen it written about, you do in things like Robinson's Ministry for the Future, there is this sense that, well, there is a privileged class of person who is able to make things happen, and everyone else is kind of just the stakes. Yeah. So talking about how it affects regular people, like I do in Firewalkers, for example. Also, I mean, the other environmental book is Saturation Point, and in Saturation Point, the environment wins. That's another way of doing it. I mean, in fact, one of the main things about Saturation Point, because it's dealing with rather than doing your traditional kind of Mad Max desert sort of environment, it's got a hyper humid environment where life is doing very well, but people cannot live. And I think that there is a sort of a conceptual model of the climate catastrophe where people are the last thing standing in that Mad Max sort of way. It's all just, everything is dead, but somehow people are still zooming around in cars shooting guns. And I think to a lot of people, that still looks like a win. Whereas if you can show them a world where life is doing extremely well, thank you, but people aren't, then that, I think, has a bit more punch to it, and hopefully without being preachy.
Yeah, I think the other thing is also to remember that there are kind of downsides, and to not minimize people's downsides. Like, I'm not talking about like people objecting to using paper straws, which honestly, who cares? Like, but it is the wrong approach to say to somebody who is struggling to heat their house in the winter that they shouldn't use the wood that they chop down out of the forest in their backyard to heat their house. You are on a losing wicket. It's not gonna, that person's not gonna take it well. You're not gonna win any friends. You're basically telling somebody, well, you should freeze rather than heat your house, because there isn't any other alternative. So these are kind of things one should be aware of. I'm a big fan of, we need to do stuff to stop burning carbon, but we also need to be aware.
Well, the other thing is, it's the idea of, oh, well, yes, you yourself, if you personally do not recycle everything, then you're destroying the planet. Isn't that there are 20, 30 companies which are doing more to destroy the planet than literally everyone in the world. Those 20 and 30 companies would love you to believe that it's you're not recycling your plastic bottles that is doing it, but it's them. They really want to feel. They really want you to believe that it's your battle, because then they can get on with destroying the planet in peace while you frantically count bottles. Yeah,
they want to tell you that it's the fact that you're lighting fires that are, that's putting carbon.
And admittedly, what I have just said was extremely preachy, and so maybe sometimes you got to preach a bit.
Yeah, but maybe don't listen to. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, so I think that one of the things that I want to do is quick fire. How do you feel about the politics in A Song of Ice and Fire?
Because I don't particularly like royal blood, kings and princes and knight stories, the politics in Song of Ice and Fire frustrates me, because although you get bits of a suggestion of, well, actually, this, you've got these guys who are doing the Robin Hood thing, and then these other people have kind of broken free, and you've got the people beyond the wall who are terribly free, but all of them, I think, are explicitly shown as not being as good as kings, as long as you have the right king. It's still very much right arse on the throne is the solution to everything. And if only X had been king rather than Y, then none of this would have happened, and we'd have been ready for the White Walkers and all of that sort of thing. So I feel that it's still very much in that, marvelous as a great deal of that series genuinely is on the page. It's still locked in that idea of, well, you've got to have a king. And obviously we don't know how the books are going to wrap that up. I'm not particularly convinced by the way the TV show wrapped it up with, yes, I shall be the king, but we'll also have no children, so it won't be a hereditary king, and therefore everything will be fine, which is like, A, you're just punting it down the road by a generation.
And B, you're literally just creating the Holy Roman Empire. Like,
yeah, I mean, it's just, I don't see the solution at the end of the TV series being remotely stable. No one, give it 5 years, no one is going to be playing nice with King.
How does Vetinari put it? It was a democratic system. There was one man, and he had the vote.
Yes.
Okay. How do you feel about Discworld?
Oh, I mean, I think Discworld is, despite the fact that obviously it's on the surface, it's a comedy fantasy thing, Discworld has some of the best world building of any set of books ever, and some of the most intelligent takes on politics of any book ever. The juggling you get around Vetinari and the guild system and Ankh-Morpork and the witches with the leader that they emphatically don't have, and all of that sort of thing. Nobody is as clear-eyed as Pratchett when it comes to power structures. So yes, I think there are a variety of books within the Discworld series which are a marvelous examination of how people do things well and or badly.
Have you ever read Tad Williams, the Siege of Green Angel Tower?
Oh, the Memory, Sorrow and Thorn.
Yes.
Yes, I mean, not recently, that was very much the current series when I was at university decades ago. I remember enjoying it a great deal. I think I mostly remember a lot of chasing about in forests and this wonderful game that Williams plays with the reader as to where the swords are, where if you pay attention, you can work out long before the characters where each of the swords is. So I'm assuming that's probably still a King's book.
It's very much still a King's book. But
yeah.
What was interesting there was that he didn't just inspire by kind of like medieval Europe. He just lifted wholesale the Christian story and imported it.
Okay, I must admit I don't recall that aspect of it at all. Although traditionally I don't tend to notice when people are doing. I mean, when I was a kid and I was reading the Narnia stories, it did not hit me as a Christian sort of narrative in the slightest. But
so no, he's got a church that the central god figure was nailed to the execution tree.
Yeah, because that's yeah. Is it an evil church though?
No. It's like the central.
Yeah. There is, presumably because an awful lot of sci-fi writers were kind of resented having to go through some sort of church education or whatever. There is about that time and earlier, an awful lot of sci-fi settings where there is basically an entire Roman Catholic Church just transplanted into a fantasy world with no logic or antecedents, just so they can have an inquisition and be bad and try and hunt down the wizards who are terribly persecuted, and all of this sort of thing. It's one of the standard models of fantasy religion is evil Catholics. And all right, history has a lot of evil Catholics, so that's fine. But it's just frequently you kind of looking at this thinking, why is the Catholic Church here? There's no precedent. There's none of the things that would lead to you having a Catholic Church and an Inquisition or anything like that exist, except that you've got all of these things just with the serial numbers filed off and the edges still ragged.
Yeah, there was a tendency at that point to write all religion, like all priests, as though they can't really believe this stuff. They're just kind of in it for the power.
There's very seldom an actual frequently you have churches with but implicitly no actual gods. There's never any you never get the suggestion in fact that anyone is particularly believes in it. The church enforces it, but there's usually a lot of cynicism amongst the priests. And then what you get, your other traditional fantasy religion models are Vikings with their kind of, everyone dies in battle, howling desert dervishes, unfortunately, and lovely pagans. And that's kind of that for a while. That was pretty much 95% of religion in secondary world fantasy.
And druids are somehow always the good guys.
Yes, well, the druids are lovely pagans because they understood the world and mother, and it was pagans in the sense of that paganism which kind of turns up in the late 19th century. And has no real connection to historical paganism, because we don't know what historical paganism in the British Isles was like, because the Romans wrote very little other than the Wicker Man.
Yeah, the Romans wrote propaganda to ensure that their war was popular back home. Like, that was what they wrote. And
it was very much, have you seen what these wicked druids are doing? We have a moral imperative to go and destroy them all. Exactly.
Like, we're going to end these druids. They're sacrificing children. So it is, we don't just knock on king tropes. There's plenty of fantasy tropes to knock on.
But again, frequently it all ties into whatever the hierarchical fantasy structure is, whatever the social structure you've got in, either you have an underdog religion like the lovely pagans, or you have a kind of an oppressive religion like the Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah. So this is a very interesting question. How much of an effect does general logistics have on politics? I'd imagine disasters needing quick reforms that have a lot of loopholes. So it depends, I guess, on the quantity of the disaster. Like, let's say you have kind of like one of those world-ending disasters that need instantaneous action, or half the planet is going to tear apart. I would imagine that people do, at that point, kind of yield a lot of things just to be safe from that. And I mean, to an extent, I did that in my world. I have a thing that was created, the Bloodgate, that was created specifically to hold back a great evil. And it has basically absorbed the magical potential of everyone for the past kind of 2 millennia. So that only the noble class has magic now because of this thing. So, I mean, people would give up, I guess, a lot in that situation. What do you think?
I mean, I suppose so. The great disaster afflicting the kingdom is one of the standard sort of, that's one of the standard scenarios that tends to happen in a fantasy novel. Whether it is the rise of your Sauron figure, or whether it is a great sort of the portal to the demon realms, or whatever it. I guess the reason logistics doesn't tend to impact in fantasy in the way that it does in the real life is most of the time the problems that afflict a fantasy kingdom are soluble with the thrusting of the right sword in the right hand into the right body. There's usually, or the sci-fi equivalent is, yes, you've got the mothership that controls the enormous space fleet, and if you can just take out the mothership, then the space fleet will no longer be a threat. And it's a narrative device that gives you the reason why your one hero can actually make a difference.
Yeah.
Whether it is that it must be this hero, or whether it can be, well, literally anyone shoving a sword into the Dark Lord will immediately dispel the army of demons that he has at his control. Genuine, complex, logistical solutions to problems lead to a much, much more complicated narrative, less focused on the deeds of a particular hero.
And I guess, like, if I think about Shadows of the Apt again, the reason why it's a 10-book series is because fully half of it is Stenwald running around making alliances with different people, or sending agents to make alliances.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, and even then, there's, I mean, it's so in the the core books, it's a 10-book series, and Stenwald is arguably the main character, but only by a little bit, because you've got so many other people doing so many other things. Yeah. And it is the victories that happen are hopefully, Stenwald does a lot of organization, but there are an awful lot of hands. And in similar, I mean, if you look at Juliet McKenna's the Lascari Revolution series, which is a great peasants' revolt fantasy, which again is something you don't get much of, but it is a explicitly anti-hereditary nobility, pro People's Revolt book. And that's a lot of people getting together to make that happen. It's not just someone strides up with a sword and says, I am the prophesied peasant revolter, and I will make the peasant revolution happen. It's just like all of these people and a lot of money and merchants and influence and various other factions all coming together to make this happen for various reasons.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to do something similar with the Tyrant Philosophers series at the moment, in the idea that there is no one king to start with. There's no evil emperor. There is no Dark Lord. There are various people who theoretically have more influence on events. But for example, you meet in the second book, you meet Varinecthes, who is an incredibly powerful wizard. He has a flying tower. He has a demon consort. He literally pisses fire when called upon to do so. And basically, most of what he wants to do is basically not have to do any of those things, because he just kind of wants to have a quiet retirement, but there are still magically binding contacts. I think the main thing you see him do in that book, other than fly his tower about in a battle, is buy a pair of slippers. And so the idea that, all right, yes, theoretically, if he wanted to be a great man of history, he probably could be, but he's very old and tired now, and he doesn't really fancy it. And everyone else is just, there is this very, very widespread medley of people of all sort of social stripes, just pulling on different strings because there are things that they individually want. And all that composite string pulling is what makes the plot of the book.
Yeah. Yeah. So just before we close out, I just want to briefly talk about this one, because have you read Earthsea, Ursula Kagin?
No, of course, yes.
So I reread that recently, and that is such a great story.
I'm raising an eyebrow at the idea that either Lord of the Rings or Shannara are not great good versus great evil, because I feel that they are explicitly that. But you're right that Earthsea isn't.
Yes,
and the Earthsea cycle is an amazing. Yeah, I mean, honestly, like everything else that Le Guin was writing at the time, she's writing something that is considerably more complex than anything else kind of going on, being produced by her peers. Yes. I think that's who would I say is writing that kind of stuff now?
Guy Gavriel Kay normally does a really good job.
Yes, I mean, I'm just. I mean, I feel some of Jen Williams' stuff.
Yes.
Has that feel to it. I mean, there's a thread running through a lot of her writing.
Yeah. But yeah, Ursula K. Le Guin's stories are amazing. The way that she does a very good job of like all sides getting a kind of like perspective, and nobody's, even when you think like it's just all the Krong Kong are bad, all the northern guys are bad. It turns out that no, some of them aren't. Some of them are good guys, and they're just
And I mean, I think if you look at Anne Leckie's fantasy, has some of that as well. I think. I mean, going back a bit, Michael Scott Rohan, is not recent by any means, but I think his Winter of the World series has a certain feel to that as well.
John Gwain also does a reasonable job. So I enjoyed his
and there is
books as well,
certainly
more
less of that sort of fantasy, but only because I think that we have kind of added more and more subdivisions of fantasy, so that obviously there are just more different stripes of fantasy you can get now than you could get when Le Guin was writing, when she was kind of creating she herself was creating her own subgenre at the time, really.
Yes, she was. And it has stuck with us. I will never ever forget the essay of Those Who Walk Away from Omelos. And I know it borrows from Dostoevsky, but it is fantastic.
And is still, I mean, I believe that there's a story or essay, Why Don't We Just Kill the Kid in the Omelas Hole, which is currently up for a Hugo nomination, I think. And so it goes to show how much of an influence she had as a writer.
Yeah. So before we close out, when is your next book coming out? What should people look out for? What is all those good things?
Well, The Hungry Gods has just come out in this last week or so in the US and the UK. This is the latest novella of my Terrible World series. It's a book about when the space billionaires come back from space after ruining it to ruin Earth again, and precisely what happens to them. And yes, I do go out and grab that if you fancy that. The audiobook is read by Emma Newman, which is always a delight. Other than that, this year I've still got to come Lives of Bitter Rain, which is a novella-length offering in the Tyrant Philosophers series, and another book I can't specifically talk about because it hasn't been announced yet by the publisher.
Okay, well, lots of good things to look forward to then. I'm certainly looking forward to the next Tyrant Philosopher, so I hope everybody else will join me. And thank you very much to Adrian for joining us today. I hope that the audience enjoyed it as well. Thank you everyone for your questions. And I will see you soon for another one.
Thank you.